Hello, everyone. On behalf of Helsinki Art Museum and Helsinki Biennial, I want to warmly welcome you to this afternoon's event, the first Helsinki Biennial talk. My name is Taru Tappola, and I'm the head of public art at Helsinki Art Museum, and also the head curator of the first Helsinki Biennial, together with my colleague Pirkko Siitari. Today's Helsinki Biennial talk launches the Biennial Events program. Many other events will follow this spring, and of course during the Biennial when it opens in the summer, and they will continue up until the autumn. This Biennial talk is the first of 3 events that we have invited Dr. Paul O'Neill to create. He has curated for us a series of lectures and discussions that deal with international contemporary art biennials. This afternoon we will hear a lecture by Paul himself. The series continues then on the 17th and 31st March with conversation with biennial curators from across the world. Just a moment. The series continues. One of Helsinki Biennial's goals is to collaborate with local art organizations and individuals. We hope to enhance the visibility of Helsinki art scene and show its great variety, energy, and high level of achievement. We also want to expand the scene with international examples and critical discussions. On that note, it's my pleasure to introduce Paul O'Neill. Dr. Paul O'Neill is an Irish curator, artist, writer, and educator. Between 2013 and 17, he was the director of the graduate program at the Center for Curatorial Studies, CCS, Bard College in New York. He has written extensively on the subject of curating, among other things. He's currently the artistic director of Publix, a curatorial agency and event space with a dedicated library and reading room in Helsinki. Publix is known also for its collaborative approach and its para-hosting program, which many of you certainly are familiar with. This lecture will take about an hour, and after that there is time for your questions and comments. And we invite you to write them on the comment screen, and Paul will answer them then after his talk. So thank you again, Paul, for creating this series for us, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Taru. Thank you for the introduction, and hello, everybody. Welcome to the first of 3 Helsinki Biennial talks, which will take the form of a contextual lecture, hopefully setting kind of a scene for some of the conversations that we will be able to have over the next few weeks. I will introduce the second and third conversation shortly after this lecture. But for now, I want to begin. And before you ask, this is not that paper. Yes, the one that explains the future of biennials, or the solution to the future of global artistic practices, its impact on travel and mobility, or the impact of such mobilizations on climate change, environmental crisis, our identities, and nor the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on contemporary art and its sustainability. And what we do now that we are no longer mobile or even publicly open. We are stuck here, wherever you are, wherever I am. I do not know, nor do I need to know, if biennials are over. They are not. And I don't offer many ways forward. Instead, I will look back so as to grasp the future with some knowledge, some context, some contextualization as a way of clearing, a way for us to see more clearly what we are engaging with when we talk of biennials. And that is to say, biennials as an historical extension of the 19th century, world exhibitions, and the model that has been adopted and adapted by a supportive contemporary art practice and contemporary art discourse aligned with the expansion of Western modernity and global capitalism. In this paper, I will attempt to bridge certain discussions around global biennials that have emerged in the last 30 years or so, some of the pros and cons within these discussions, and the impact of their proliferation on an understanding of the figure of the curator. With more recent debates around curatorial and global culture more generally, I will also give you lots of facts, some history, and some analysis, and maybe some critique. I will do this by initially advancing some ideas that have been developed in two publications, The Culture of Curating, and more recently, the Culture Curating After the Global Roadmaps for the Present, which was co-edited with Simon Shake, Mick Wilson, and Lucy Steeds. And this looks specifically at the implication of transnational curating, globalized contemporary art, its flows, and its public perceptions more recently. This is an image of the first Venice Biennial. Over the past 30 years or so, let's say since the 1980s, it has become commonplace to talk of a global art world, and what this implies in terms of an international system of circulation and representation of art and its discourses. The most evident transformation within contemporary curatorial practice and contemporary art has been its increasing operation at an international, transnational, multicultural, and global level, with the local and global in constant dialogue with one another. Beginning with Venice in 1893, followed by those such as the Whitney Biennial in 1932, Sao Paulo in 1951, Documenta in 1955, there was initially a slow uptake to new biennials until their explosion in the 1980s. In Contemporary Magazine's special issue on curation in around 2007, there was a substantive list of 80 official such biennials or such exhibitions to have been held around the globe between 2005 and 2006 alone. That is in 80 official biennials. More recently, that is at the beginning of 2021, there are 273 biennials registered of various scales and modalities in the world today, which also points to the vitality of contemporary art and its much needed geographical diffusion into the provinces and sites, and an emergence of other global art centres. Since the 1990s, this expansion in particular has taken place beyond the global north and has produced and spread awareness about art and engaging new audiences around the world. This is most apparent since the 1980s with the growth in Global South Biennales, a period which saw the emergence of a spate of new host cities in the Southern Hemisphere and developing world, including Havana in 1984, Istanbul in 1987, and latterly in the 90s, Dakar in 1990, Sharjah in 93, Shanghai in 94, Guangzhou in 95. According to research conducted in 2011, most biennials were still located in Europe at around 50 plus, followed by Asia, there were 20, just over 20, and then the Americas, 20 plus. What is revealing is that the local locus of growth in recent years has been firmly in Asia, where numerous examples of high-profile new biennials and triennials have been curated since the mid-1990s. Guangzhou, Shanghai, Busan, Guangzhou, Beijing, Singapore, for example, following wider economic and political changes in the region. More recently, instigated by biennales exist in various stages of gestation and development in cities across Asia, including those in Kochi, in Yinchuan, in Lahore, Karachi, Bangkok, and Yokohama, which only opened last year in 2020 during the pandemic. The Biennale, or the biennial, is a default exhibition model across the world and has a capacity as a promotional tool for nations and city branding, making it irresistible to cultural policymakers to such an extent that it's become a homogenizing force, a model to be copied rather than subverted. In examining discussions around these exhibitions, it is notable that Les Magiciens de la Terre in 1989 seemed to pave the way for the emergence of a model of curatorial practice which went beyond previously established Western centres or epicentres of artistic production. Since 1989, within the context of large-scale recurrent exhibitions, curatorship has primarily maintained a transcultural approach and looked to the concept of the multitude as a productive force against what Hart and Negri, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, have called empire, the new global order enveloping contemporary civilization. At the same time, the curators of such exhibitions have supported a general view of cultural globalism as a productive frame for a more inclusive exhibition, with globalism itself providing a central thematic or a central theme in which the biennial has continued to mobilize an expanded, centralized position for the figure of the curator. A definition of biennial. The phrase biennial or biennale, depending on one's cultural background, has become an all-encompassing shorthand for large-scale international group exhibitions which occur every 2 to 5 years. They are perennial. Such exhibitions were identified by John Miller, writing in the early 90s, as blockbuster exhibitions or mega exhibitions because of the scale of their attendant audiences and the sheer volume of their material contents. The term biennial, therefore, describes a specific genre of large-scale exhibition, typified by a propensity for a large number of works, particularly new works or new commissions, an ample budget, and an ambition to be part of the international art world nexus. Whether they refer to themselves as biennials, fairs, or recurring events, these exhibitions have internationalism at their core, in the sense that having the global art world within their horizons, an aspiration which often dictates the nature of their inquiries. The majority of these exhibitions emphasize the international nature of cultural and artistic production, where it is not a question of a unified vision, but rather a consideration of internationalism as a theme under dispute in diverse ways. This implies that contemporary curatorship transcends geographical boundaries and looks to global networks of cultural production for its source material. Such internationalism or transnationalism sits comfortably with the identity of the biennial as a temporary, mediated space that is transformed at recurring intervals. While the specific motives of each biennial diverge and change over time, the mode of operation is similar. It would be fair to say that these exhibitions demarcate a space for dialogue and diverse artistic and cultural exchange. Amongst other things, they are interfaces between art and wider publics. The general public. Publics that are at once local and global, resident and nomadic, non-specialist, and art worldly. Since the late 1980s, the move towards a more integrated, global exhibition model has been facilitated by a number of key shifts within the curatorial framework of these newer biennials that I introduced earlier. And three factors which characterize biennials may now be defined as: 1, the end of the primacy of national selection; 2, the end of embedded notions of establishment within the art world; and 3, the participation of artists beyond the established Western centres of art in the interest of new transnationalism. These global operations also make apparent how the twin concepts of the global and the contemporary have functioned as two parallel leitmotifs for sustaining the biennial as a dominant exhibition model. Biennials as a contemporary global phenomenon. The term global was first coined in the 1980s, associated primarily with farming activities or farming practices, to designate the point at which the local and global intersect in a network of interrelations. As part of a constant dialogue between the local and the global, wherein local economies adapt their systems to suit their own needs whilst maintaining being part of a global market. Glocal can be described as an increasingly dense superimposition and interpenetration of global political, economic forces and local regional responses within the parameters of a single, rescaled framework of state territorial organization. The politics of localism are particularly significant in the case of local biennials, in which the city or town, from Berlin to Lyon, Venice, Havana, Beijing, Dakar, or Helsinki, usually suggested in the title of the exhibition event, acts as a rhetorical maneuver in appropriating cultural status by framing the place as a central node within global production networks. Here, meanings and myths occupy the collective imagination, affording the location of the biennial a centralized position within an international exhibition of art. The exhibition event becomes the site and context at which art is experienced through the modality of a one-off event. By definition, it provides a short-lived experience of art, usually 12 weeks or 100 days, has become the standard, and makes statements about the art world at a given moment in time. In the process, the place of exhibitions begins to determine what kind of art is included and who the viewers are, as well as determining the position and centralized locus from which the exhibition will be read. Bruce Ferguson, Rhys Greenberg, and Sandy Narn stated in 2005 that the location of an international exhibition constructs a map of the world from the perspective of both the city and the country that sponsors it, underlining any notions of an equality of nations. Biennials connote temporary spaces of mediation, usually given over to a core team of curators, often supported by a local socio-cultural network and linked to the global art market or markets. They provide an efficient format for the articulation and consolidation of an international art economy and its market forces, and for its sponsors, its dealers, collectors, funding agencies, and so forth. In many ways, the expanded network of biennials have advanced kind of post-colonial approach and have effectively embraced art and artists from the peripheries, or the so-called peripheries, beyond the dominantly Western, European, and American internationalism. But as Jessica Bradley stated or argued in the 2003, they function as a more responsive and spectacular means of distribution. Quote, one that can efficiently meet the accelerated rate of exchange and consumption parallel to the global flow of capital and information today. While curatorial aspirations are frequently concerned with addressing cultures in flux and eschew cultural nationalism, the motives for establishing these events can nevertheless reside in a desire to promote and validate local, culturally specific production within a global network. End of quote by Jessica Bradley. It is this interrelational attributes of both culture and location that are the most obviously marketable aspects of global tourism upon which they depend. Locality embodied in the promotion of tourist spots, specific local specialities, sites, culture, and produce are actually the most reliable economic revenues for local communities. It has been argued that during these times of culture as spectacle, artistic production is a catalyst for culture to be globalized, attracting financial investments as well as audiences. Eva Mosqueto also argued in the early 2000s that during these times of culture as spectacle, artistic production acts as a catalyst for globalized culture, attracting these investments. Whereas biennials and art fairs are happening in more and more places across the world, they have adapted cultural tourism as a means of securing a place in the international arena of economy and culture, wherein artists, curators, critics, art dealers, patrons, and sponsors nurture a clearly defined production system through labour division, which produces hierarchical roles for the participants. Occurring as they do at regular intervals, biennials are always in the process of reinventing themselves, moving from local to global networks with emphasis upon all things contemporary and new. They are representative of the art world in need of keeping up with things. As punctual manifestations of the latest trends, they produce, promote, and reconfigure the concept of the contemporary as artistic practice through new commissions, with artworks often produced to correspond with their location or made specifically for a novel curatorial framework. Thus, biennials have some power to present a view of the world via the social subsystem of the field of art. Although very few biennials operate on the scale of Documenta, Venice, Sao Paulo, Manifesta, Gwangju, or even the Whitney or Istanbul, however, while many tend to be improvised, localized, and modest in what they intend to achieve, it is the specific homogeneity produced by the biennial condition that is of interest here and has often been criticized, and not the heterogeneity of the myriad of localized cultural statements. Setting aside the distinguishing issues of scale, temporality, and/or locality, the transformation of curatorial practice made manifest by such exhibitions is mainly articulated by biennial leaders as the overly politicized, discursive, and essential positive effect of globalism. When interviewing numerous biennial curators associated with the last 30 years, and some of them who are perhaps most visible within global biennial curating, such as Hans-Ulrich Obrist, he refers to the biennial in positive ways. The biennial is a catalyst, he calls it, that can activate multiple temporalities, whereby the necessity for the coexistence of several time zones in exhibitions enables a great variety of different contact zones. Whereas for Charles Esche or Vasif Kortum, when they were curating their Istanbul Biennial in 2005, they suggested, quote, the biennial can identify and define a position for art in the public consciousness and create the conditions from which it can be further explored. For Ute Mette-Bauer, who has curated a number of biennials, including Berlin and as a co-curator of Documenta 11, and the next curator or co-curator of Istanbul Biennial, Ute suggests that the biennial is a rare opportunity left in the art world for curators to make a big statement, to get heard. It's not to show off, but to get certain issues finally across on a much larger scale than the majority of curated exhibitions. This leaves the biennial model open to the kind of spectacularization that Ute Mette-Bauer alluded to when she described her experience of curating biennials as a possibility that had to be used to make a point, which is to a certain extent spectacular or even controversial, to stick out. What is apparent is that the new white cube, or not so new white cube anymore, requires a spectacular kind of art, as much as it necessitates an expansion in the global art market to fill its spaces. A number of curators and artists have profited from this nomadic cultural industry whose practices suit such conditions of production. And this has led to a level of predictability as one feature of the experience of biennials, or what the late, great Okwe Emwieser has put it, by now those of us who travel the great autobahns of the international circuit, where art and otherness join symbiotically, know what to anticipate, perhaps too hastily, of exhibitions that limn the sharp contours of the multicultural image world. End of quote by Okwe. The biennial model has contributed towards these discourses whilst being concerned with an overemphasis on all things new and novel in the here and now. Biennials often end up promoting the concept of the contemporary less as a rejection of the past, but instead as a vehicle for art's co-option into the marketplace. Every biennial is under pressure to be dynamic, to be charismatic, and capable of identifying new artists, artworks, and art worlds for their exhibition content. Equally, the administrative and political agencies behind most biennials aspire to be more contemporary and to have greater global reach than their counterparts. This often results in a hyperbolic culture where new art is first overexposed in the windows of biennials before being sanctioned by the art market from Venice en route to Basel. In the process, the institution of the Grand Exhibition privileges the organization's position, or the curator's position more specifically, as a leading authority, with the results appearing as an organic inevitability. In other words, the institutional framework behind them supports an illusion of an overarching curatorial inspiration, which is presented to imagined and real publics as a fait accompli. By contrast, the public as people, as places, or as mobilizing concepts, can be understood not only as a concrete entity to be deconstructed or pluralized, it can also produce or constitute itself. Such a notion of the public as being under construction thus provides it with agency that can have effect upon the social and the kind of spaces in which we socialize and by which we are in turn socialized. Large-scale exhibitions institute an assumption that there is a common and collective experience at work, when in fact this is brought about through an unspoken collusion between the well-oiled art event machine and its attendant audiences, made all the more possible by the carnival atmosphere of the grand gathering of global art world observers, which is particularly evident during the open spectacle of the private view. And of course, pretty much everything that I've been saying is prior to the last year of our lives. In the absence of any alternative narrative or substantial opposition, the author-curator becomes the subject most conspicuously responsible for the production and mediation of exhibitions. Embedded in the institutional mechanisms, the curator becomes the primary producer of exhibitions of art as statements upon and on and about global culture. The presentation of a unified and unperturbed space obscures the vast amount of real and immaterial labor on the part of numerous individuals, administrators, and assistants, which are voluminous within the organizational structure of a large-scale biennial exhibition model. As Charlotte Bidler acknowledged, a more connected global art world places, quote, hard pressure on the labor market for cultural workers, end of quote, as evidenced by the expansion of the biennial model. There's a separate paper to be written, and perhaps has been written in many different ways, about the emergence and consolidation of curatorial programs that have helped provide laborers or workers for this particular expanding labor market. The biennial curator's capacity to extend a worldview leads to the biennial being the type of cultural event in tune with capitalism's colonial expansion in pursuit of new labour markets. Globalism in the context of the Grand Exhibition often appears via the art world, which is, or perceived to be, an ostensibly unified place in which creative and cultural differences can be integrated whilst maintaining or retaining a diversity of identities in coexistence with one another. In many cases, the biennial model seemingly bolsters a definition of globalization as a benign, accelerated process which embodies a transformation in the spatial organization of social relations, generating transcontinental or intergenerational flows and networks. Exemplifying this process, the biennial is presented as an inevitable product of the contemporary global condition. Although biennials often acknowledge, or those responsible for biennials often acknowledge, the impossibility of presenting a total worldview, they also appear to consider this limitation as a fundamentally productive aspect of the global condition at their disposal. Since 1989, biennials have become the vehicle on the international art circuit through which much art has been validated and acquired and has acquired its value. Biennials play a more pivotal role in the local context, where curatorial vision can indeed shape the way in which we form an understanding of global culture. Here, biennials become devices through which art can interpret the world for its viewers. Equally, such exhibitions demonstrate how diverse creative activities can coexist with the modalities of different cultures represented together in one site of display, akin to an organic global cooperation. This portrayal of the biennial as a kind of cooperative organic body of overlapping differences accords with what Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's description of globalization as an inexorable and irreversible process of economic and cultural regulation of exchange that is assigned to the new sovereign global power that they call empire. In contrast to imperialism, for them, empire, or the term empire, establishes no territorial center of power and does not rely on fixed boundaries or barriers. Instead, empire has materialized as a decentered and deterritorializing apparatus of rule that expressively incorporates the entire global realm within its open, expanding frontiers. To counteract this, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri also posit the emergence of the plural multitude as, and I quote, productive creative subjectivities of globalization that have learned to form constellations of singularities and events that impose continual global reconfigurations of the system, end of quotation. The multitude is put forward by Negri and Hart and has been adopted by many biennial curators as, I quote, a political subject as posse that begins to appear on the art world scene as a biopolitical self-organization made up of cooperative and convergent subjects who are taking responsibility for directing and managing immaterial modes of production, social work, and creative action. The multitude reimagines the working classes as a heterogeneous group of migrant cultural workers, social cultural movements, and cooperative networks, offering some form of collaborative resistance to the global hegemonic power of empire. Whereas it has been argued that biennial culture on the whole has adopted the figure of the contemporary multitude as an inherently benign or benevolent and creative force for the good. "15 years ago, the writers Bruce Ferguson, Risa Greenberg, and Sandy Narn already warned by the early 1990s that they had seen what they called an equal measure of both the aspiration and apprehension in a rather prophetic essay when that had already begun to question the fundamental idea of the International Survey exhibition. Their collective essay ended with the paragraph, "However progressive the political or economic intentions behind them," I quote, "international exhibitions still invite a presumption that curators have access to an illusionary worldview and that spectators can follow in their wake. But a more specific and sustained engagement with communities and audiences, creating meanings behind or beyond the spectacle, and mere festivalizing of such occasions may produce a new genre of exhibition. It seems that in order to accommodate both artists' needs and the audience demands, this new exhibition must have reciprocity and dialogue built into its structure. How successfully this is accomplished will determine international exhibition maps of the future." And this is their writing in 2005. And I think it's quite interesting to actually look back at a lot of projections from the early 2000s as to how exhibition models that took the form of the biennial, how they emerged and transformed and adapted based on these projections, and what came true and what never happened. As was predicted through their citation, these event exhibitions have shaped new social, cultural, and political relations in a more globalized world, where the traditional biennial model is maintained through discourses on cultural policy, national representation, and internationalism, thereby enabling cultural travel, urban renovation, and local tourism. Alternatively, it is also arguable that they have become polarizing spaces to legitimize certain forms of artistic and curatorial work within the global culture industry. What began as a critique of both Western modernism and the colonial approach to other contemporary cultures has resulted in a rethinking of how, where, and which art is seen in the context of international exhibitions. Biennials and large-scale temporary recurring exhibitions have succeeded in providing models of resistance to the hegemonic power of Western art history, museums, and established art institutions. They have also done this by introducing new spaces for critical reflection, overseeing the growth of more heterogeneous and transcultural audiences, and participating in a complex network of global knowledge. In doing so, they have enabled a greater diversity of artistic positions, so that artists and curators need no longer rely on established museums and institutions, which are much slower to take up their work. Biennials have supported an elite network of increasingly mobile and well-connected professionals, whilst contributing towards the rise of an ever-increasingly more dense global exhibitions market. Biennials as large-scale exhibitions have embraced globalism as an easily adoptable model for reconfiguring the art world. There is also an assumption that what happens on the biennial circuit, as well as international art fairs, equates to global culture. As Thomas Bouteau had argued when analysing the emergence of these new biennials in the 1990s in particular, he suggested that the contemporary art world embraced this global phenomenon as an opportunity to reinvent itself, led by the art world's main protagonists, impressed as they were, I quote, the size and power of emergent global circulation and the pervasive raggedness of this new world, focusing on global coherence and using it as a leverage to integrate sites of artistic production previously considered marginal to Western modernism, end of quotation. By Thomas Bouteau. Alongside cheaper air travel, greater mobility of populations, and the advent of internet technologies, art professionals were afforded greater access to places, peoples, and cultures. The art world radically transformed itself from a universe principally organized around a few Western centers and metropolises, which virtually excluded the contributions of individuals, artists, curators, critics, historians from the Americas, Asia, or Africa, into a remarkably dense international web of institutions within which professionals from all continents and amongst all nations move about, work, and debate the role of art in a larger context. According to Elena Filipovic, the proliferation of these new biennials in the 1990s was also seen as a paradigmatic alternative to the museum, when in fact they often mimicked them, rendering them equally privileged sites for cultural tourism, and introduced what she calls a new category of art of bombastic proportions and hollow promises that earned itself the name biennial art, where their accompanying curatorial discourses demonstrate a propensity for extraordinary promises, far too often followed by the inevitable disillusionment for the visitor as they fail to deliver. Because of their spectacular need for the attention of their roaming publics, there is a new category of art in need of bombastic proportions and hollow promises that earned the name biennial art, in which accompanying discourses, as I've said, demonstrate a propensity for extraordinary promises. Biennial art as a niche market in itself was parodied by the curators Jens Hoffmann and the artist Maurizio Catalan in the exhibition Blown Away, the 6th International Caribbean Biennial in 1999 already, for which they invited a selection of artists including Vanessa Beecroft, Olafur Eliasson, Marika Mori, Chris O'Feely, Elizabeth Payton, Tobias Rayberger, Rickard Gervania, and many others, who in their view had been the most ubiquitous on the international biennial circuit. The project was advertised, marketed, and mediated through the standard art and media channels. But upon arrival in St. Kitts in the West Indies, the artists and curators enjoyed a holiday together with no exhibition actually taking place. Afterwards, they produced a glossy full-colour catalogue with holiday snaps, text, and statements representing the experience. Thus, the Caribbean Biennial could also be seen as a cynical, privileged, self-reflexive critique of the nomadic curator, increasingly responsible for seeking the new in far-off places. Parallel to the proliferation of biennials was another kind of art that emerged in the 1990s, when shifts in the structural organisation of cultural production meant that artists were required to respond to new locations each time they were invited. This caused what Mi-Won Kwan called values like originality, authenticity, and singularity to be evacuated from the artwork and attributed to the site. According to Kwan, there was a general valorization of places as the locus of authentic experience, which created a sense of there being a coherent relationship between place and identity. The placement of art in the context of a biennial is therefore complicated by this disjuncture between the location of production and its eventual display, and subsequent display thereafter. A typical experience is one in which art made elsewhere and brought to the site of display, or when the artist is brought into the city from elsewhere to make work in situ that responds to it, is partially removed either from the original site of its artistic production or from the place in which the artist mainly works. In this new context, the work becomes identified through its coherent relationship with other works in the curated thematic exhibition and or its place amongst other works selected from the international art world and the attendant global art market. Furthermore, biennials enable a displaced viewership representative of a fragmented idea of globalization, whilst presenting an organized sense of an art world in free flow with the market. The globalized cultural sector does not necessarily behave any differently from global capitalism. In fact, it often mimics it. Biennials cannot aspire to a cogent assessment of globalization because they are wholly shaped by global pressure. However, as an exhibition model of our times, they remain a significant means of understanding how the art world functions. Since the late 1990s, what the late Bruce Ferguson has called discursive biennials, there is a more commitment to dialogical, pedagogical, and local entanglements rather than on curatorial game playing. Okwe Emwieser's collective curation of Documenta 11 in 2002 and the introduction of the 5 discursive platforms was particularly important in that respect for such a large-scale exhibition to take the discursive and debates around the post-colonialism as the central node within the content and discussion of the biennial contents. Conferences, interdisciplinary events, workshops, educational activities, and public discussions have become increasingly important elements of biennials. This was not the case prior to the early 2000s, or I would say certainly the late 1990s. And for example, other pedagogical or discursive approaches have been, most notably, What Hound for Whom's organisation of the 11th Istanbul Biennial, What Keeps Mankind Alive, which was accompanied by a reader they called the texts, which not only looked at the ways in which the means of production had been captured by the curators as part of their research process, but also employed text as a means of elaborating upon the influence of Brechtian Marxism upon their own thinking and the content for their exhibition. Now, this may not seem such a radical thing to us now, but at the time already, only very recently, this was quite seen as quite a radical shift to focus on the textual production of an exhibition in the form of biennial rather than the artistic materials. Documenta 12, which followed Biennial's Documenta 11, created parallel art educational programs as well as quite an involved and elaborate international magazine project for which 90 publications with different focuses from around the world were invited to think collectively about the motifs and thematics of the Documenta, generating 3 particular issues which looked at modernity, life and education, and were intended to act as navigation for readers and visitors to Documenta. These are but a few examples which endorse the view that biennials are now understood as vehicles for the production of knowledge and for intellectual debate as part of a much wider turn towards education and pedagogical practices within art and curating, or expanded curating. Biennial's Documenta 11 certainly led the way in decentering the locale of knowledge production, and which has continued over the last 20 years, which saw a kind of an instrumental turn towards discourse production and political activism as a key part of biennial culture. 2 further examples in this respect were in 2008 when the Biennial de São Paulo and the 6th Marquesal Biennial in Porto Alegre in 2007. Both of these biennials took a discursive approach and adapted similar models to that of Documenta 11. In São Paulo, they dramatically reduced the quantity of artwork to make way for a theoretical pause that devoted itself to debate and discussion around the need to reconsider that particular biennial's original mission, and expressed the need to understand what kind of alternative the biennial mission or system could be to the museum circuit, which started to mimic each other, certainly in a Sao Paulo context, Brazilian context more widely. In Porto Alegre, there was a prioritization of a program of educational and discursive activities that preceded the exhibition, proactively engaging with local constituencies and prolonging these relations thereafter. So kickstarting conversations with local protagonists within the cultural centres in Porto Alegre, from the small to the medium organisations, and continuing them beyond the exhibition event. This has become increasingly apparent within biennials. Important in this respect also, and perhaps more geographically near to Helsinki, the Bergen Biennial, for its first installment, decided enough was enough. Time to look at what we have done already under the title "To Biennial or Not to Biennial," and exhibited no art at all. Instead, the curator organisers held a 3-day conference to consider the impact of the biennial phenomenon to date, to identify and explore existing biennial knowledge from different regions of the world, and in turn to reflect on their history, socio-political and economic contexts, as well as their impact on artistic and curatorial practices. This Bergen Biennial is now titled the Bergen Assembly, which continues to take a discursive approach to gathering its publics alongside the exhibition of artworks. But To Biennial or Not to Biennial was a welcome moment of a time out from exhibition production. This biennial was offered as a long overdue space and time for reflection upon global curating and biennial histories, its practices and its potential futures. The events alternated between a symposium on a globalization of curating and biennial culture, a questioning of the legitimacy of having a biennial in Bergen, and a biennial in the form of discursive exhibition as the main event. But Bergen at that time represents, I think, a rare moment of respite from the overproduction of the last 20 years or so. Perhaps another gathering is now necessary almost 12 years later, but this time it could be framed differently. Something like under the question of, if to biennial is the answer, then what kind of biennial was the question, or even is the question? Much work has been done since Bergen, and a slow decolonization of exhibition history since Documento 11 has been made evident within many publications, and more specifically in After All's exhibition history series and elsewhere, acknowledging that a much more de-Westernizing, decentralizing, and decolonizing of our knowledge is needed. What these books and their associated exhibitions show us is that given the enormous number of artists, curators, and cultural producers across the world who have never been involved in the biennial, measured against the relatively small number of those who have participated and in being in charge of so many biennials, it would be wrong to assume that any universality of the effects of the biennial model on expanding our notion of the art world, never mind the world at large. The art world is a multi-centered place, as much as it is multicultural, and its global spread makes differentiation between its numerous iterations increasingly difficult. Given that the past 20 years have given us so many differential models, this no longer so new genre of exhibition has shown how the potential and the difficulties of gathering together so many contradictory representations in a single location. Biennials occurring at a moment at which curatorship opened out to become an expanded field that went beyond mere display and material production to take account of the discursive and distributional modes of exchange, whilst acting as catalysts for challenging what we know and the ways in which it becomes known. Although the expansion of the exhibition, the biennial exhibition model is both a symptom and a condition of our globally networked age, its myriad forms have provided small moments of resistance, dissensus, antagonism, and counter-spectacle in relation to the grand narratives of art history, consumer culture, mass entertainment, and the market-driven economic forces of global capitalism. Increasingly, and across the world, museums and art institutions have tended to take uniform appearances in their layout, how they look, their administrative facilities or faculties, and in certain regards with the art that is displayed. Largely in format and content alike, they cater to and follow Western examples. Many biennales, like art fairs, follow suit. At the same time, staging biennales and other art events are often defined by local political and socio-economic circumstances and interest, and live a precarious temporary life, thus allowing divergent and changing propensities, positions, and perspectives to prevail, which is a productive element of biennales. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. And what began in 1989 as a critique of both Western modernism, Western modernity in particular, and took a more post-colonial approach as an essential means of critiquing dominant ways of exhibiting other contemporary cultures, this has resulted in a rethinking of how, where, and which art is seen in the context of international exhibitions. Biennials and large-scale, temporary, recurring exhibitions have succeeded in providing models of resistance to the hegemonic power of Western art history, and slow-to-react museums and privileged established art institutions have slowly but surely begun to follow suit. Even in the last 5 years, one could say. With the emphasis on decolonizing, de-Westernizing, and decentralizing the contents of these mega institutions, museums, established art institutions, and so forth. Biennials have also instigated a significant shift towards a discursive, as I have said, but also towards more collective and collaborative models, finding ways to resist overproduction and capitalizing and there are many other examples in this respect. For example, in 2002, the Gwangju Biennial, called Pause, focus on self-organization and small-scale initiatives across the world. Or in 2008, as I said, the Sao Paulo Biennale and the 6th Mercosur Biennial, 2007. These are some of the many examples in which biennials have tried to change their form. Perhaps another, sorry, I've already used that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so there are many examples which have highlighted the potential resistances that took place in more discursive biennials and building upon local constituencies with this shift away from the exhibition as the main event, the educational turning, curating and art more widely, and more discursive approaches to biennials. Such exhibitions, which have taken the form of pop-up biennials, such as Survival Kit in Riga or EVA, International Biennial in Ireland, or the late David Madalas London Biennial, which includes everybody that submits to it, to the aforementioned Bergen, to the last two editions of Berlin, which each focused upon yet took divergent approaches to feminist activist curating, to the messiness of anti-eroticism with a focus on anti-racism, sexuality, gender inequalities, and the practice of queering the biennial, with transfeminism, cross-generational practices brought to the centre stage. Then there's also been an increased number of biennials which have been collectively curated and have taken an intersectional feminist approach. Then there's also exhibitions which have, in spite of their national political context, such as the Industrial Biennial in Ural in Russia, or the failed Manifesta 6 school in Cyprus. There are many examples where the urgency of biennials have been brought to the fore, such as the Off Biennial in Hungary, which happens to be a lifeline for many to the homeless emergency biennial, which has been nomadic of the last 10 to 15 years, and then to the recent actualization of biennials such as the Yokohama Triennial, which took a trans-global approach, and Riboka, which in spite of its conditions last year, ended up being realized in collaboration with the pandemic. Many biennials have contributed to recognizing the limits of the construct and looked beyond the parameters of both the singly authored exhibition event and might be also thought of being the beginning of attempts to rethink the curatorial not as individually authored work, nor of being aligned to market interests, but as a constellation or field of social relations, para-educational and activist approaches. Given this context, or this newer context, global phenomena and its impacts and influence on taste and culture more broadly, a closer empirical analysis of international biennales is both urgent and I think timely, especially at a time of reflection, of global lockdown, and this, what I'm hearing, a kind of an emphasis on a return to a kind of localism or a new localism. It's certainly a time for reflection. Can this moment that we are all in currently, bring about new ways of thinking about public time when we have so little of it? Can we imagine new temporalities for art, its experience, its institutions, beyond its eventfulness and beyond the screen as a primary solution? How can we be intimate with one another across a longer time stretch than every 2 years? Can we have lasting relationships during a time when we are distant from one another? Can we negotiate a future whilst being apart so that we can be more prepared or more in tune with one another when we can reconstruct or restructure our fight against inequality, racist, anti-immigration regimes of injustice, so as to deglobalize, decolonize, and to counter free market global regimes of debt and dispossession, instating possibilities for post-nation, counter-nationalist, anti-fascist social and political life. This is, of course, a tall order, even under the best of times. But it seems to me that globally conversant biennials must be part of these struggles. For any future freedom must be inclusive and all-embracing. Our autonomies are not resolved in any separateness from one another. It is not a liberation away from one another, but the post-global, post-pandemic autonomy is not found in isolation or immobility, but an emerging and continuous process of finding ways of coming together as one, as a singular, plural, global subject. So what of biennials after the global? The 1990s, as I've suggested, was the beginning of market-driven cultural economies, and they became inescapable outcomes of the globalization of art, its educational provision, and their increased capitalization. As such, now it has become commonplace to talk of a globalized art world, with specific circulations of discourses, commodities, and individuals, and even to speak of contemporary art as a driver of globalization. If not a driver, it certainly is one of the main byproducts of global capitalism within the cultural educational spheres, and the figures of the international artist, the jet-set curator, and the grand exhibitions could be said to be many of the primary and prominent forms and outcomes of art's increased globalization over the last 30 years or so. Whilst curatorial themes may change from one exhibition to the next, the question of inclusion does not. It is in fact one of the constants that accompanies any biennial, whereby global exhibitions serve as, quote, from Greenberg, Narn, and Ferguson, global exhibitions serve as grand collectors and translators of subjectivities under the latest phase of globalization. The globalized cultural sector does not necessarily behave any differently from global capitalism. In fact, it often mimics them. Biennials are one of the dominant manifestations of a kind of globalization, one that is joined up, networked, and driven by existing mechanisms of centralization and dissemination. Global art remains a crucial node in the larger network of interrelations, a network that is almost entirely penetrated by the market. Global art large-scale exhibitions cannot aspire to a cogent assessment of globalization because they are wholly shaped by global pressures. However, as an exhibition model of our times, they remain a sufficient means of understanding how the art world functions at more global, universalized levels. This universalization of what art is or can be is so often presumed to be claimed and invoked at the cost or expense of local or national traditions and any sense of locality and embeddedness. But what exactly does this mean to be global in our present time, or to be local in the context of transnational cultures and its artistic, curatorial, and theoretical knowledge and practices? These are key questions for our present time. I would like to propose for now two definitions of this present time. This present time as being post-global, that is after this period of globalization, which I've been discussing, which evolved and developed in parallel to the biennial of the last 30 years. Our first attempt to perhaps describe this is as such. For biennials and for curatorial practice, the lure of the local has been long held as an important place to offer as a model of resistance to neoliberal globalization, to climate change, to climate crisis, and its violence, either through an outright rejection of the multicultural parameters or paradigm of international biennials and art fairs, or in the establishment of alternative networks, proclaiming that another globalization is possible, either through instituting new models and platforms, or in an attempt to reform or subvert existing formats and institutions. Both of these strategies have exemplified how deviant ways of curating locally after the advent of globalization can be a critique of neoliberal politics of deregulation, displacement, and dispossession, which we all know have had disastrous effects on individuals, their communities, and our environments. This would be the first definition of perhaps our present time, one version of what the local can provide. It should come as no surprise that the spaces where globalization is represented, that is the international spaces and institutions of art, are also places where globalization is contested. But it must be noted that globalization has, of course, also been very beneficial for contemporary art, or more precisely, for the art world as such, a so-called world system of art. The success of contemporary art then has been partially, if not wholly, dependent on globalization, on a systematic level or a systemic level. So even when contested and criticized by curatorial projects or by criticism and even by artistic practices and activisms, it would be correct to say that globalization has also been very good to contemporary art and vice versa. They are unlikely companions. This leads perhaps to a second definition, an even more troubling definition of where we are currently in terms of curating the biennial after the global, namely that the current politics of deglobalization and its effects on the art world and its circulation in discourses on subjects, discourses, and objects. All across the world, we are now witnessing, and have been for quite a while, a reaction to globalism in the form of rejection, xenophobia, anti-internationalism in the form of the march and success of the populist right, and its preference for autocratic, strong men with names like Bolsonaro and Erdogan, Modi, Netanyahu, Orban, Putin, Trump, and so on. What these leaders and their followers share, amongst other things, are a disdain for the very liberal and humanist values of contemporary art and its permissiveness, preferring instead a political agenda of so-called illiberal democracy. It should also be noted that their policies are a response to the economic effects of neoliberal deregulation and global trade in favor of protectionism and neo-nationalism. In other words, it is both the ideology of contemporary art, its proposed value, and its economic support structure, globalization, and thus its creation of surplus value that are under threat here, directly under attack. This is then not alter globalization, but after globalization, and as such not an actual political alternative to global capital, but rather a cultural response to the breakdown after decades of absolute hegemony of neoliberal deregulation and globalization. And just as the established political systems of the extreme center is scrambling to respond to this crisis, so too is the art world. And its central activity of curating must ask itself how to move forward and curate after the global. How will the political changes that are openly hostile to contemporary art and all its values affect the production, distribution, and sustainability of the art world system as we know it? So there are two different versions of the same present time. This moment I would call, or I've called with my colleagues, being after the global. What implications do we see for the biennial, for global curating and global contemporary art? This is a present moment of transformation of what this new post-global will be, with art and culture offering conflicting ideas of the local. One side as being open, globally networked and inclusive, or secondly, as closed, protectionist, nationalist, and exclusive, being two of its primary battlegrounds. This must be our concern when biennials, as one of the outcomes of the global, are being critiqued and taken down by more centralist right-wing thinking. We need to look again at how connected contemporary art and globalism has been. Likewise, look around you. What is open? What is open and closed? What is our present time? Where can we be open? When museums, libraries, schools, universities, theatres, cinemas, public spaces of gathering are so easily closed down, with public life more often closed than open, whereas spaces of consumption, from banks to bars to restaurants, shopping malls, in-person and online, are all open. The internet is open. Commercial art galleries are open. So how can these spaces of private viewing and gathering be considered as potential spaces of publicness? How can we occupy them as part of a wider global condition of narrowing, slowing down, breaking down, and a stillness that suggests a moving towards a more inwardly looking, globally connected biennial? It's important to remind ourselves that we cannot be floating islands to sustain ourselves. And who cares for it, or who cares for these islands and how they are used must be a collective concern and will contribute towards any potential biennials of the future. The recent pandemic, has shown us that we all breathe the same air. We are post-global, and we are a post-global and connected species. This is our inescapable condition. We also know that the consequences of globalization, from climate crisis to inequalities to protectionist responses, we recognize the structural fault lines within global governance structures, which are primarily based on dominance and control. Any intersectional analysis will show us that the systems of race, social class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationhood, and age class form mutually constructing features of unequal social organization, which shape experiences and in particular affect those who are most vulnerable. But it is this interrelatedness, this plurality, that shows us we are already post-global and intertwined for good or for bad, and this must be the basis upon which any future biennial departs. We can see how nimble small to medium-scale initiatives can be when things are closing. Look around the world at how many large institutions are struggling, are closed, some forever. The amount of people who have been made unemployed, for example, within these institutions globally. Yet, biennials continue to open. Bangkok opened recently, Gwangju is opening, Helsinki is opening, as far as we know. There are many alternative forms of international solidarity, specifically within the arts and as exemplified in certain prominent curatorial and institutional practices. And currently, when listening aloud to current discussions within contemporary art, there is an emphasis on generosity, on openness, on intimacy, on hospitality, on intersectionality, on anti-racism, on togetherness, on commonality, as catalysts for change. But our current reflection can only be speculative, can only be uncertain, provisional in imagining our most recent present, before we can begin to institute new thinking, as well as new forms, models, disciplines, and lived practices for more equitable futures. The biennial positioned after the global, that is, after the historical emergence and possible demise of a particular Western-centric globalism. There can be no return to normal or to the pre-global. There can be no return to the local without the global. Our time is already after the global, which should not be such a scary place to restart. But it must mean that we cannot go it alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a beautiful insight into the very various and very many different aspects of the global exhibition and the problematics of the biennial.
Thank you.
I must say I particularly loved that you said that a new autonomy is not found in isolation, but in coming together, and about not being floating islands. Can you tell a little bit more of what kind of concrete possibilities do you see in that kind of attitude? What could that concretely mean in our current scene here locally or even globally?
Well, I think if we have 30 years of knowledge production, we have 30 years of exhibitions, if not more, to look at and to consider and to learn from. So I think it's also important somehow to look backwards in order to look into the future. So what one will see when analysing and seeing all those exhibitions individually and collectively is how interconnected they are, and also how interconnected the world is. Also, one can see how destructive some of those biennials have been to some particular local artistic communities, but also how they've been generative, how they've brought certain cities onto the art map, but also how they have enabled emergent cultural scenes to begin and to grow and to sustain themselves. So I think that in terms of seeing this interconnectivity between the biennial and so many other activities that happen in and around the biennial, but also that happen in and around the city of the particular biennial, I think is important. But also to connect how all biennials are somehow connected in a way. That there's a certain visibility that biennials achieve by virtue of their very existence and being branded or named as a biennial. So how does the Helsinki Biennial, how does it speak to Riga? How does it speak to Bergen? How does it speak to the Nordic and Baltic regions? How does it speak to Asia, which I see as being in greater, closer proximity to say the United States of America, for example, as being a conversational partner or whatever. But I think that what I'm often hearing is in terms of critiques of biennials is not only their effects on climate change, of course, which is of current urgency, but a certain kind of drive or need for returning to a kind of localism, which never really kind of existed, and also to emphasize for me the dangers of this kind of inwardly looking model of localism, which has been exploited by the populist right over the last few years. But I think it's also to look at other ways in which the local can be generative of new possibilities and ideas to the future and so forth.
I would very warmly like to thank you, Paul, for this. This has been really a pleasure and very interesting to hear, and just beginnings of future discussions. Many beginnings here.
Yes.
Also,
thank you.
Thanks to our audience.
Absolutely, thanks to our audience.
And Dave, in these comments, there are lots of thanks and congratulations to Paul. We'll continue in 2 weeks' time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Taro, and thank you to everybody. I hope you're all safe and well, and see you on the 17th, if not beforehand. Thank you.